It all started with something small, a simple disagreement about where my land ended and my neighbor's began. I honestly thought it would blow over. But I was wrong. My neighbor, Karen Davis, didn't like being told she was wrong, especially not by someone like me. She was the type who thought HOA rules were more important than state laws, and she had friends on the board who backed her every move. One day I came home and saw her outside wearing gardening gloves and holding a hammer. She was building a fence, but it wasn't just on her property, it was cutting across the back corner of mine. The worst part, she blocked off the small creek that ran through the easement, the same creek I used for fishing and watering my beehives. I didn't want to make a scene, so I walked over calmly and showed her a copy of the property map I'd gotten from the county. It clearly showed that the land she was fencing off didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. Karen looked at the map, raised an eyebrow, and said, "This looks fake." I told her it was. I even offered to give her a copy, but instead of listening, she walked away, dialing her phone as she went. 15 minutes later, a sheriff's car pulled up. Deputy Rogers stepped out. He was familiar with Karen, and honestly, he looked tired the second he saw her. She tried to spin the story fast. "He's trespassing, he's harassing me, he's threatening my property." I handed the deputy my paperwork. He looked it over, asked me a few simple questions, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am," he said, "your fence is over the line. You're gonna want to take it down." Karen didn't say a word, just stared at me, arms crossed, lips tight. "You have a good day now," Rogers added as he left. I thought that was the end of it. But Karen had no intention of stopping. In fact, that was just her warm-up. 2 weeks later, I came home to something that made my stomach drop. My fence had been cut not once but in 3 different places. Deep tire marks were pressed into the mud near the creek, like someone had driven straight through on purpose. One of my beehives had been kicked over. The wooden frames were scattered, honey oozing into the grass like someone had stomped on it for fun. And that's when I heard it, my dog Pixel, yelping from the back of the yard. I ran over and found him limping, holding up his paw. Blood dripped from a deep cut. Right beside him was a nailboard, a wooden plank with rusty nails sticking straight up. Someone had left it hidden in the grass. I rushed Pixel to the vet. They cleaned the wound, gave him antibiotics, and told me to watch for infection. I nodded, but inside I was boiling. I wasn't just dealing with a boundary fight anymore. This was sabotage. And I was done playing nice. That same day, I ordered 4 motion sensor security cameras, ones that sent real-time alerts every 10 seconds until I told them to stop. I wasn't going to miss a thing this time. I also hired a professional land surveyor, Nora Beltran. She didn't take nonsense from anyone. She marched out to my property in steel-toe boots, planted fluorescent orange stakes at every corner, and posted laminated signs explaining that tampering with survey markers was a crime. Everything felt secure for one night. Then at 1:13 a.m. my phone buzzed. Motion alert, then another, and another. I opened the camera feed and watched 2 figures in hoodies creeping along the fence line. One of them pulled up a survey stake and threw it into the creek. The other had bolt cutters. For a split second, the moonlight lit up their faces. If I had facial recognition software, it would have been easy, but I didn't need it. I had Deputy Rogers. He took one look at the footage and said, "Yep, that Chandler, local idiot, been on our radar since the check kiting mess in 2021. The second person was shorter, with platinum blonde hair sticking out of her hoodie. No doubt about it, Karen. Rogers moved fast. By dawn, he had a warrant and 2 deputies with him. They knocked on Chandler's door at 6:30 a.m. Body cam footage later showed Chandler answering in pajama pants, yawning, pretending he'd been asleep all night. Rogers just held up a printed photo from my camera. It showed Chandler mid-step, holding bolt cutters and grinning like a fool. He went quiet. Karen didn't do much better. When they searched her garage, they found the stolen orange stakes, my survey signs, and a half-empty can of green spray paint, the same color used to deface my no trespassing signs. Karen said Chandler had stored stuff there without her knowledge. But Rogers had her dead to rights. They were both arrested and taken to county jail. Karen posted bond by lunch. But Chandler didn't. Turns out he was still on probation, and this little adventure might have just earned him a one-way trip back to prison. While Chandler sat in county jail, things took a sharp turn. My lawyer, Elliot, wasn't just any lawyer. He had a calm voice, but when he started digging, he didn't stop until he hit the truth. First, he filed a motion to subpoena the HOA's financial records. We wanted to know how the fence that Karen built had been paid for. And there it was, a cashier's check for $3,500 made out to a local fence company. The signature, Chandler. But here's the shocker. The check was drawn directly from the HOA's reserve fund. That gate wasn't some private purchase. Chandler used HOA money to fund Karen's land grab. We kept digging, and the more we found, the worse it got. It turns out Chandler, who managed the HOA's bookkeeping, had been busy. Over the past year, he wrote multiple checks, all labeled grounds improvements, but none of those projects had ever happened. There were no new benches, no landscaping, no tree trimming. Just a long paper trail leading to $46,900 in fake expenses. The HOA board, once Karen's biggest cheerleaders, looked like they'd seen a ghost. At their emergency meeting, they voted unanimously to press charges against Chandler. That's when Detective Miriam Page entered the scene. She was sharp, serious, and didn't waste time. Her team seized Chandler's laptop and uncovered even more fraud, forged receipts, fake meeting minutes, and a whole folder of fake approval stamps, including a green neon one that looked oddly familiar. That's the one they used on all those approved by HOA forms Karen waved around like a badge. But that wasn't all. They found bank transfers, money moving from Chandler's HOA account into Karen's personal checking account, disguised as consulting fees. Now it was Karen's turn to panic. She hired a big-shot defense lawyer named James Hall, who charged $600 an hour and refused to speak to the press. Karen started avoiding everyone in the neighborhood. She wouldn't even open her blinds. But Chandler, he cracked fast. He knew his probation was hanging by a thread, and the DA had just filed new felony charges for fraud and misappropriation of funds. That meant real prison time. So he did the one thing that could save him. He agreed to testify. He admitted that Karen had been behind the whole plan. She convinced him the HOA was wasting money and that they could redirect funds toward more useful projects. In return, she promised to give him a piece of my land once the annexation went through. Everything he did, faking invoices, stealing stakes, defacing signs, was at her request. And he had text messages to prove it. The DA now had enough evidence for a full case. They offered Chandler a deal: testify against Karen, serve a few years, and maybe get out early on parole. He took it. Meanwhile, I started noticing little wins. The new HOA board publicly apologized. They took down the gate. They replaced my broken fence. They even voted to remove Karen's backyard access to the creek, something I had asked for years ago. Then one afternoon, I found a small check in my mailbox. It was from the HOA's insurance policy, $1,250 to cover Pixel's vet bills. It wasn't much, but it meant they were finally taking responsibility. The tide had turned. Karen and Chandler weren't just annoying neighbors anymore. They were officially under investigation for a full list of crimes. And for the first time in months, I slept through the night without checking the cameras. But the real battle was just beginning. Because next came court. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Karen sat stiff in her seat, eyes darting from the judge to the jury. Chandler, now in an orange jumpsuit, kept his head down. He had already pled guilty to violating his probation, which gave him an automatic 18-month prison sentence for the original check-kiting charges. But he wasn't done yet. In exchange for a lighter sentence on his new charges, Chandler agreed to testify truthfully. Everything, every detail, every message, every midnight trip across my land. And he didn't hold back. He told the court how Karen had orchestrated the land grab from day one. She wanted control of my property for herself and the HOA. She promised Chandler he could build a tiny house on my land if he helped get things moving. That meant fake documents, illegal gate installations, and nighttime sabotage. The prosecutor played ring camera footage showing Karen and Chandler loading rebar and spray paint into her SUV at 12:47. The timestamp matched the night my survey stakes disappeared. Karen's lawyer tried to blame everything on Chandler, but the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too clear. Her fingerprints were on the fake receipts, her name was on the consulting payments, and her face, well, that was on every video. In the end, both were found guilty. The charges included felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and trespassing. Chandler was sentenced to an additional 4 years in prison with parole eligibility in 2. Karen's sentence: 18 months behind bars plus $32,000 in restitution to me and $46,900 to the HOA. She was also slapped with a 5-year no-contact order that would continue even after she got out of prison. When the judge read her sentence, Karen looked stunned, like the world had shifted beneath her feet. I looked her in the eyes just once. Then I gave her a small, polite wave, not out of anger, not even revenge. It just felt like closure. Later that day, I took Pixel for a walk down by the creek. The trees were just starting to bloom again, and the wind carried the smell of honeysuckle. For the first time in a long while, the land felt peaceful. Sure, it had taken months of court hearings, depositions, and late-night stress, but justice had finally been served, and with Karen gone and Chandler locked up, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, quieter. I started to think about the future again, not just about keeping my land safe, but about what I could build on it. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip behind the trees. And I smiled. Because this time, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking forward. With Karen and Chandler gone, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, like the land itself was finally breathing again. The new HOA board, now made up of folks who actually cared, mailed me a formal apology. Inside the envelope was a check for $4,500, money recovered from Chandler's frozen account. It was marked for property repairs and beekeeping losses. I didn't expect it, but I was grateful. The bees had been part of my life for years. It felt like justice in the small things. Instead of rebuilding what Karen had tried to destroy, I chose something new. Where she had once planned to annex my land, I built a greenhouse, a big one with panels that caught the sunlight just right. Inside, it smelled like fresh soil, tomato vines, and beginnings. Pixel took to it right away. Every morning, he'd trot through the dew-covered grass, circle the greenhouse, then lie in the sun by the door like it was his job. The land that had once been a battleground was now a place of growth. The bees returned, the flowers bloomed, the creek ran clear. I even started a small garden near the spot where the illegal gate once stood. Carrots, zucchini, peppers, it was like nature was helping me rebuild, one plant at a time. Neighbors who had kept their distance during the conflict now waved when they passed. Some even stopped by to ask about the greenhouse or bring over baked goods. It felt like the community was healing, too. But I knew the story wasn't completely over. Because just when I thought things had finally settled, something new showed up in my mailbox. About a year after the trial, just when life had finally settled into something peaceful, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from someone named Elaine Castor, claiming to be Karen's cousin and, more importantly, the heir to her property. She wrote in fancy legal language, but the message was simple. She claimed that Karen had granted her a private right of way across my land. It was nonsense. But it was dangerous nonsense. If people believed it, or if a judge did, it could open up a new legal battle over property rights. I handed the letter to Elliot, my lawyer. He barely blinked. "Let's get to work," he said. We pulled out the old surveys, the updated deed, and all the camera footage from last year. Elliot even got a handwriting expert to review the deed Elaine provided. It took only 2 weeks to confirm it was a forgery. The notary stamp was fake, and the date didn't match Karen's official records. In fact, the document had been created 3 months after Karen was sentenced. Caught red-handed, Elaine backed off. She withdrew her claim before the court hearing. Still, it shook me. I had finally started to feel safe again, but the letter reminded me that some people will always try to take what isn't theirs. A few weeks later, something more surprising arrived, a restitution check. It was from the state's Crime Victim Fund. Karen's prison wages were being garnished at $58 a month and sent to me. It would take decades to repay what she owed, but the amount didn't matter. The gesture did. It meant the system still cared, even if just a little. Then came a second letter, this time from Chandler. He was still in prison but had earned a paralegal certificate through a re-entry program. His letter was different, no tricks, no claims, just an apology. He wrote about what he did, how wrong it was, and how he understood the damage he caused. At the bottom of the letter, he included a hand-drawn map with suggestions on where to plant fruit trees and sunflowers. It caught me off guard. I didn't know what to think at first, but later that night, I sat on the porch and looked out across my land. The bees buzzed, Pixel barked at a rabbit, and the idea of an orchard didn't sound so strange anymore. So I wrote back, "No promises." But I told him one thing. The sunflowers were already taller than ever. It's funny how life works. A year after everything, I got a call from a local nonprofit called Sprout Tomorrow. They'd purchased Karen's old property through a county auction and wanted to turn it into a community garden. They had read about my beekeeping and greenhouse work and wanted my help. They asked if I'd consult on planting native pollinators and setting up beds for vegetables and herbs. I said yes, how could I not? The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had once tried to control everyone through HOA rules using fences and fake power. Now her land was being used to feed the community. On the first volunteer day, I walked over with a brush cutter and a few seed trays. To my surprise, Deputy Rogers showed up too, off-duty and in jeans, holding a shovel. A few new HOA members came as well, offering snacks and lending a hand. The place where Karen's fortress used to stand was now wide open, the fence torn down, the gate gone. Raised beds were lined up in neat rows. Kids helped plant cherry tomatoes. Elderly neighbors watered the herbs. Laughter filled the air. We spread compost, we planted wildflowers, and someone found one of my old no trespassing signs buried in the dirt. We all had a good laugh about that. As I looked around, something clicked. This was more than closure, it was transformation. Pixel chased a butterfly through the grass. The bees moved from bed to bed like they belonged there. The land didn't feel like it was scarred anymore. It felt alive. The volunteers asked if I'd keep helping. I said yes again. Later that day, I stood by the greenhouse and looked across both properties, mine and what used to be Karen's. The sun was setting low, casting golden light across the rows of new life. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't just feel like I'd won. I felt free. By the time October rolled around, the garden on Karen's old land was in full bloom. Sprout Tomorrow hosted a harvest dinner right there in the middle of the raised beds under strings of warm lights. They served dishes made with vegetables and herbs grown just steps away, roasted butternut squash, garlic honey carrots, and heirloom tomato bruschetta. I brought a jar of fresh honey from my beehives, and someone used it to glaze a tray of warm cornbread. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years came by to share a meal, pass a dish, and talk like old friends. One of the organizers gave me a quiet nod during the dinner, thanking me for everything. I just smiled. The real win wasn't about credit. It was about what we had all created together. And as the seasons turned, so did the page on this long, wild chapter of my life. I built a new barn, fully permitted and standing right where Karen's illegal shed used to be. I used some of the reclaimed wood from her structure to build the doors. It felt symbolic. The past didn't have to be forgotten, it just had to be rebuilt into something better. Now the fields are peaceful again. Pixel runs through the tall grass with his tail wagging. The bees hum in harmony, and every time I walk the fence line, I know it's not just land I protected.